Have you ever been genuinely confused when to eat your protein? Pre-workout, post-workout, within the anabolic window, across 6 meals? The advice is everywhere and it contradicts itself constantly. Most people trying to optimize their protein intake end up paralyzed by questions that, it turns out, don't actually matter that much. Here's what nobody in the nutrition space wants to admit. Most of the protein timing advice you've received is either overstated, misapplied, or flat out wrong. And following it incorrectly can actually make results worse, not better. I'm going to share with you 4 practical tips to ensure that you never have to worry about timing again. Hi, if you're new here, I'm Harry. I have a degree in plant science, spent the last 10 years in agriculture and food systems, and I run a hemp protein brand called Canteen. I spent a significant amount of time in the research on protein metabolism, and the gap between what the science says and what gets repeated is wide. Let's get into it. The post-workout anabolic window, the idea that you have 30 to 60 minutes post-training to consume protein or the muscle building signal disappears, is one of the most persistent myths in fitness nutrition. The most cited research paper on this topic found a lack of evidence for a narrow anabolic window, and even proposed the anabolic window could be as wide as 4 to 6 hours. An even larger study found that any positive effects were linked to a larger protein increase rather than timing of consumption. In other words, when total daily protein intake was matched, timing effects largely disappeared. The window isn't 30 minutes. It's at least 4 to 6 hours around the training, if any. The supplement industry built an entire product category around a post-workout shake you have to have immediately after exercise, which isn't built on science. What that means practically is if you're eating adequate protein distributed across the day, the exact timing of any individual serving relative to your exercise is largely irrelevant. Total daily protein and leucine amounts per meal are variables that move the needle. Timing is a distant third, so you don't need to optimize for the window, only the day. But certain distribution across the day does matter, just not in the way most people think, and the common approach gets it backwards. Most people eat very little protein at breakfast, moderate amounts at lunch, and then try to hit their daily protein targets at dinner. This is both harder to execute and metabolically suboptimal, and the consequences compound quietly over time. Protein synthesis is more efficient when it's distributed equally across meals. Each meal needs to clear the leucine threshold. That's roughly 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine to trigger a meaningful muscle protein synthesis signal. A small breakfast that doesn't clear that threshold is a missed muscle building signal regardless of how much you eat at dinner. You cannot compensate for a missed signal earlier in the day by eating more later. Furthermore, the synthesis response to a very large protein meal does not scale linearly. There is a ceiling, and protein above this response is used for other purposes other than muscle building. Aim for roughly equal protein at each eating occasion, with each serving clearing the leucine threshold. If you're on an animal-based diet, this could look like 30 grams of protein. If you're on a plant-based diet or plant-based leaning, this could look more like 40 grams of protein. The extra protein needed is to compensate for the lower leucine content in plant protein. As an example, for breakfast, I like to mix up hemp protein with Greek yogurt along with nuts and berries, which comes out to about 45 grams of protein and 2.5 grams of leucine. This single structural shift, applied consistently, produces better outcomes in muscle protein synthesis than any post-workout timing. Fix the distribution before you worry about the window. Once distribution is right, there is one timing variable that does matter, and it's one almost nobody talks about. The one timing window with genuinely good evidence behind it isn't pre or post-workout, it's pre-sleep, and the fitness industry almost always ignores it. Muscle protein synthesis continues during sleep, but it requires amino acid availability to run. If your last meal was 7 p.m., but you're sleeping from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., that's an 8-hour window your muscles do not have access to amino acids. The research, primarily using casein, which is a slow digesting dairy protein, consistently shows that pre-sleep protein increases overnight muscle protein synthesis by around 22%. The mechanism is simple. Slow digesting proteins release amino acids gradually, keeping availability sustained overnight. Casein works because it's slow, but casein isn't the only slow digesting protein. If you want a plant-based version, hemp protein contains albumin, a protein that digests at a similar rate, which makes it plausible for a plant-based alternative for the same overnight effects. So any slow digesting protein before bed, cottage cheese, hemp protein, steak, chicken, they all work. Just give yourself enough time before sleeping. If you're going to add one timing behavior to your routine, this is the one with the clearest evidence and the lowest friction. The post-workout shake the industry sells you is speculative. The pre-sleep protein is not. So the anabolic window is overstated, distribution matters more than timing, and pre-sleep protein is generally evidence-backed. But there's a contrarian point worth mentioning, because the entire framing around meal timing has a significant flaw in it. The 6 meals a day approach, which is eating small, frequent, protein-containing meals throughout the day to keep amino acids elevated, has been fitness advice for decades. But the evidence for it is very weak. Here's the counterintuitive finding. Muscle protein synthesis does not run continuously. It spikes in response to a leucine threshold clearing meal and then returns to baseline over 3 to 4 hours, regardless of whether you eat again in that window. Eating again before the signal has returned to baseline does not extend or amplify the response. It just adds calories. The more important implication is what happens when the meal does not clear the leucine threshold. A 15 to 20 gram protein serving, a handful of nuts, some yogurt, a small chicken breast may not be enough to trigger muscle protein synthesis in the first place. You've eaten protein, but you haven't sent the signal. As mentioned earlier, clearing the leucine threshold requires about 30 grams of protein on an animal-based diet and around 40 grams of protein on a plant-based diet. So the 6 meals a day doesn't just add unnecessary eating occasions, it actively risks fragmenting your intake into doses that don't clear the threshold. But 3 meals of 30 to 40 grams outperform 6 meals of 15. A little often in certain circumstances can produce worse outcomes than a larger meal less frequently. The practical implication isn't to eat more frequently. 3 protein adequate meals remains a sensible target. Quality of signal per meal matters more than frequency of eating occasion. 3 meals that each clear the threshold outperform 6 meals that do not. But are you actually absorbing all the protein you're eating? That's a different question entirely, and most people assume the answer is yes. I break it all down in the next video.